Hi, everyone. Welcome to this U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights webinar on resisting displacement from Jerusalem to St. Louis, stories of colonization and gentrification. My name is Sandra Tamari, and I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Adalah Justice Project, a Palestinian human rights organization in the U.S. that utilizes art, education, and advocacy to promote freedom, equality, and justice for Palestinians. The Adalah Justice Project pursues a strategy of de-exceptionalizing Palestine, which means that we seek to insert awareness of Palestinian issues in progressive communities in the US by connecting to issues of oppression, marginalization, and suppression within the US context. I'm also the co-chair of the steering committee of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and I'm really grateful to the US Campaign for organizing this webinar, especially to Rama and Anna, and for inviting me to facilitate this timely discussion. The displacement of people is an enduring injustice across the globe, whether due to conflict, disasters from climate change, development projects benefiting corporations over humans, or colonization. People are being forced from their homes, their communities, and their land. As we know, President Trump recently announced that the US will be moving its embassy to Jerusalem, which provides Israel with impunity to continue its colonization and Judaification of the city. Israel is making great efforts to create an overwhelmingly Jewish majority, which threatens thousands of Palestinian residents with forced displacement and continuing dispossession. One of the main tools of colonization in East Jerusalem is Israeli land and planning laws that make legal the confiscation of large amounts of Palestinian land. There are many other tactics that I'm sure Ingrid will get into, including a recent law that was passed that makes it legal to revoke residency for anyone that Israel deems to be in breach of loyalty. At the same time, resistance in Jerusalem is being criminalized and made more and more dangerous. There's a high price for resistance. And we're seeing that home demolitions, revocation of residency, jail time, and extrajudicial killings are part of the framework of what's happening in Jerusalem. And Israel's actions in Jerusalem are merely a microcosm of its colonial project across Palestine. At the same time, in St. Louis and in marginalized communities across the US, the logic of colonization drives government takeover of private property in the form of eminent domain, the use of natural disasters to reestablish segregated communities, and housing covenants that bar Black and brown communities from certain neighborhoods. So the goal of this webinar is to explore some of these parallels. As we discuss the logic that drives displacement in both places, we acknowledge that the specifics of each context is different. However, we can learn about settler colonialism in Israel by examining colonial tactics and mindsets in our own backyard. My hope is that we can speak forcefully against racism and dispossession in Palestine from a principled, coherent, and consistent position by recognizing our own complicity in colonialism as settlers here in the United States. Intersectionality provides an important lens to examine how our oppressions are tied together. At the same time, it provides a mirror for us to examine the ways in which we participate in systems of oppression. The parallels between Zionist and US strategies to dispossess people allows us to more effectively communicate about Palestine to US audiences unfamiliar with what is happening to Palestinians. You often hear the refrain that it's a very complicated issue. Palestine is impossible for Americans to comprehend. You need a PhD, you need years of study. But I think that what we do by connecting our struggles is allow people a way to connect through their own lens of oppression. They can be easily brought into this conversation. And I'll just offer one example of the power of this strategy. Last November, as part of an Adalah Justice Project delegation to New Orleans, we convened a briefing for housing advocates in the city. We described several examples of the ways Israel displaces Palestinians from their land. We spoke about the Admissions Committees Law, a law that allows Israel to prevent Palestinians from taking up residence in Jewish settlements in the Nakab and in the Galilee. The law says that it's important for a committee to establish the social suitability of new residents. Obviously, social suitability translates to exclusively Jewish. So the law allows for the rejection of any Palestinian citizens of Israel who might want to live in these neighborhoods, and it legalizes segregation without outright saying so. New Orleans housing advocates responded with immediate connection to their own struggles. In the post-Katrina era, they talked about ways in which Black residents of New Orleans were kept from returning to the city through a variety of zoning laws, housing policies, and urban renewal that priced much of the city's Black families out of the city. In St. Bernard Parish, a mostly white area of New Orleans, the infamous blood relative ordinance was passed. This required that landlords, who were mostly white, rent to relatives within 3 degrees of separation. The ordinance was enacted to keep St. Bernard Parish white and segregated. Eventually, it was found to be unconstitutional, but we can see, while the details of these tactics are distinct, the logic is very similar. So I'm very pleased to continue this conversation, to explore parallels with our 2 distinguished guests today. They are Sheila Rendon and Ingrid Jaradat. Welcome to you both. Sheila is a St. Louis resident who was removed from her home by eminent domain. And Ingrid Jaradat came to Palestine from Austria during the First Intifada. She is a sociologist by training, and her expertise is in the field of human rights and international law related to occupation, colonization, and apartheid. She has worked with human rights organizations for over 20 years, including as a founder and member, the first director of Badil, Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, and as coordinator of international advocacy with the Civic Coalition for Palestinian Rights in Jerusalem. So welcome to you both. Sheila will speak first, followed by Ingrid, and we will have time for a discussion afterwards. So thank you very much, Sheila, for starting us off.
When Anna contacted me, she told me that there was a direct connection between things that are happening in St. Louis and things that are happening all over the world. I don't think that my neighbors realize how connected they are to, communities outside of Missouri. Far from their ideal would be, that they could have some sort of story that would be directly related to things going on in the Middle East. But oppression is everywhere, and people must realize that. What happened to us was shameful, to say the least. It should have been considered unconstitutional. However, it's not. Eminent domain is within the laws. It's within the rights of the agency, the cities, and the counties that the development is coming to. And St. Louis is so hungry for development. We are a city that is 325,000 population from the last census, 2010. So in competition with our nearest sister city, St. Louis, is far less in population than Chicago, which is over 1 million, and Memphis. So there is always competition for development. And our neighborhood was a neighborhood that had been severely neglected since probably 1970s. I was born in 72, but my brothers and sisters were all born in the 50s, so they were in their 20s when I was born. They saw a sharp decline, maybe about 1976, 77. And the city of St. Louis did absolutely nothing to remedy the decline. They actually encouraged it by bringing in negligent developers. They also land banked property and we were subjected to brick theft, which would bring more decay to the community. Complaints were made. The city building inspector made it seem as if he was concerned, but he did absolutely nothing to remedy any problems that or complaints that we had. Our leadership was woefully inept, and any efforts to recall or try to primary these individuals was met by severe castigation by the community. We were told that we were troublemakers, my husband and I, and that if we were to stand in the way of future development, then it would never come. So in 2014, we were told by a notice being placed on several poles in the neighborhood that there was a development that would likely come to our neighborhood, and if the site was chosen, our portion of St. Louis Place, that we would be asked to leave. So there was, of course, pushback from that. We've had people living in their homes for nearly 50, 60 years. My family had been in the home since 1963. So we were not unlike any of our other neighbors. We moved into the community, moving from communities like Port-Igo, or like my family, they were in a cold water flat. And this was their portion of the American dream, as it had been given an opportunity to people of color. We were moved into homes that were built in the 1800s with minimal remediation. Lead and asbestos was still present in some of the homes. So that was a reason that some people chose to move quickly. But the offers were made to the people in the community that were so low that they weren't able to find homes in the city that they could afford. They would have to pull new mortgages, and in some cases, the homeowners were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they had not paid a mortgage in over 60 years. So they were shocked to find how expensive the city was and how comparable homes that were brick and two-story were not even in their price range as far as what the city told them their homes were valued at. So gentrification became all too real to the people who had never even heard that word before. They got a crash course in what displacement was and what gentrification is, and then possibly the idea of never being able to reside in the city became 1, 2, 3 punch. So by the time the National Geospatial Agency, which is the spy agency that they use as an example of the technology and the new way of fighting wars, decided to move to my neighborhood, most of the residents had signed agreements. However, my husband and I and a church and 3 businesses had not. So we had to go through the process of eminent domain, which is, it is the idea that you have to tell a group of strangers what your home means to you is mortifying at the least. You cannot imagine how it feels to have people walk through your house and judge your property, judge your church, and tell you what the value of it is. The value, as I told several times, the city tried to pressure those of us who had not signed agreements to take the money, because once the project is underway, or once the decision is made that eminent domain is something that people don't want to go through, we were told that our property would be devalued to the point of nothing. But my husband and I, we persevered, and we were told that because the family had been in the property for over 50 years. There was a 50% over what the eminent domain court decided. So it gave us the opportunity to be able to remain in the neighborhood, unlike many of the people who could not afford to stay. So with that, my husband and I, we bought a 4-family flat for us to live in while we made an agreement with the city to buy a property that had been vacant for 20 years. We decided to pool our resources and invest back into the community. What we'd like to do is be able to stop any other Paul McKee type entity from coming into our community again. We want to let the people who live here, the people who are still here, know that this community is great. It's not just our proximity to downtown, which we are a 15-minute walk to Union Station, maybe a 20-30-minute walk to Busch Stadium. It is the fact that people endured in this community when times were tough. The 1980s were not forgiving to this community. We were ravaged by drugs and crime. We managed to stay here. We managed to keep our community safe. We self-police. We had a series of brick thefts and arsons that were directly related to Paul McKee, who is the developer that started to buy property in the early 2000s with the city's hand. They allowed him to buy and vacate and demolish his property at will, which caused our property values to drop. We point this out every day. We fight, we struggle. We continue to let any person who does not know or is not familiar with our community know that this is not us, but we will shine a mirror at every opportunity that we can. We have people who come through the community when they see that there's a big fire at a building like the James Clemens Mansion, which was directly related to the author Mark Twain. It was his niece's home. And the property was a stately mansion and it was untouched until Paul McKee got his hands on it. And then it was ravaged by fire this summer, so it had to be torn down. That was a property that definitely could have been reflective of old St. Louis architecture. Appreciate the fact that, you know, there are buildings in certain neighborhoods that have been forgotten that are still stately. So with the loss of certain buildings, you have to turn to what you have, and what your resources are your property and yourself. So what we have done is started several projects that would beautify and make our neighborhood relatable to anyone who may want to come here, who can see that they would want to raise children here. They may want to retire here. But it is a very nice, quiet, safe neighborhood now, and we've made it that way ourselves. Our whole goal is to ensure that anyone who is here is not priced out, that they're not taxed out. Once this project is completed, which the scheduled end date is 2024, that's a long way from now, but it's around the corner. When development time seems long, but once processes start, it happens so quickly. We want people to understand that they do not have to leave, that they can rebuild their community from the ground up. We have so much open space here. People call it a prairie, an urban prairie, but what it is an opportunity for people who have long waited for their elected officials to do the right thing, to start to decide what they want and make the decision on the right thing themselves. So we're spearheading that. We have gathered a lot of great minds in the community, a lot of people who remember what the neighborhood looked like prior to the downfall. And we asked them to put their ideas together and give all sorts of, no idea is too big or too small. Give all sorts of ideas so that we can culminate and bring together a community that we all love.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'm glad you're in your new place and that you're settling in.
Thank you.
Ingrid, please, we're happy to hear from you.
Okay, so in Jerusalem, forcible displacement has been ongoing basically at least for 70 years. So I thought I would show you, it's a collection of like the main measures that have been displacing Palestinians. And the main perpetrator in our case is the state of Israel and Israeli authorities. So it's very much a state-run enterprise. And so I will show you just some examples of like what are the main measures. So first of all, typical is that whenever there is a war or a major armed conflict, then we have had two waves of mass expulsions of Palestinians from Jerusalem, first in 48 and then in 1967. So together approximately at least 90,000 Palestinians were expelled from the area that is West and East Jerusalem today. Now, what is maybe like even more relevant is the systematic preventing of return of displaced Palestinians, so that we have each time we have a mass expulsion and refugees, people can never return, which means that because this preventing return is also based on legislation, it basically means that people have no longer any status in Jerusalem or in fact in the country, which also means that under Israeli law, they have no rights and claims, which is connected to the third measure, which is the systematic appropriation of the property of displaced people. Basically, what is West Jerusalem today, about 65% of the area is land that belonged to Palestinians before 1948. And in East Jerusalem, we have an ongoing process of land confiscation and also of homes and businesses, and also forced evictions. That's in East Jerusalem, basically settlers and Israeli authorities collaborating in getting Palestinian homeowners and tenants evicted. And now what is being, or let's say a measure that has for long not been like really so well understood, is that in fact Israel decided to create a separate civil status for Palestinians who remained in occupied East Jerusalem after 1967. So they are separate from Palestinians in the rest of the occupied West Bank. They have separate ID cards, and so this measure, together with the military closure of the city, we have checkpoints and the wall and the system of entry permits. It has basically meant that most of the Palestinians living in the occupied territory no longer have a right to enter or decide to come live in Jerusalem, are basically closed out because they are identifiable by their ID cards, which are different from those living in Jerusalem, and they need permits to enter the city. Now, this has, of course, been devastating, both at the individual level, because we have families divided, living in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, who cannot really live together anymore. And it's been devastating for the city as a whole, because it has resulted in a loss of business, markets. So basically the decline of East Jerusalem is very much related to this separation of the people and the closing off of the city. So not only that people in Jerusalem have a separate civil status, they also were given a civil status that is deliberately does not protect their right to stay in the city. So they are not, they don't have a status that is equal somehow to citizenship, but they are permanent residents as if they were visitors in Israel, which means you have no guaranteed right to stay and you cannot pass on your status to children or spouses, wives, husbands automatically. So this has been used by Israeli authorities to revoke residency permits of Palestinians living in Jerusalem, and we have almost 15,000 of these revocations recorded. There may be more since 1967. And also there is no right to family unification. So basically most of the applications for children and spouses to come live in Jerusalem have been denied, and it's basically impossible to get family unification under a new law since 2003. So basically that's closed. So no new people can actually become Jerusalem residents. Now, in addition to that, we have like a systematic like withholding of adequate public services. You can clearly see like the low, the bad living conditions in East Jerusalem. And it's accompanied, there is no public housing, for example, and there is a shortage of schools and classrooms, and the streets are not maintained well, and lightening and garbage collection. So everything, it's like in a kind of like dilapidated, deliberately dilapidated state. And in addition to that, not only is there no public housing, but also private Palestinian construction is severely restricted. Like there is only about 13% of the city zoned for Palestinians. So in fact, Palestinians can only build in this zoned area, and they need a permit, which is difficult to get, expensive, and takes many years. And when Palestinians build homes without a permit, these homes are regularly demolished. So we have alone since 2004, about over 750 family homes destroyed, of course, causing displacement of people. And a newer phenomenon since basically 2004-05 is the wall that Israel built in the West Bank. Now in Jerusalem, they built the wall in a way to cut off some of the Palestinian neighborhoods. So they would be on the other side. They are still in Jerusalem, but they are on the other side of the wall. Plus, after this, the Israeli municipality basically stopped all public services behind the wall. And they are until now discussing whether it wouldn't be possible to exclude these neighborhoods completely from the municipal area of the city, which means that Palestinians living in these neighborhoods would no longer be residents of Jerusalem. And then we have related a policy of like censoring Palestinian school books so that children and youth cannot really learn about Palestinian history and their identity. We have closure orders against Palestinian institutions, NGOs, or even like events that are happening in Jerusalem, so that there is little opportunity for people to get together and to discuss and to develop strategies and ideas about like how to resist these measures. And when people resist, and we have seen this more and more lately, especially since 2014. Protests are repressed more and more forcefully. So we have had, it's in fact, we have a kind of like a militarization of repression in East Jerusalem that is very similar to what happens under the military government elsewhere in the West Bank. So that we have also let force used in a way like indiscriminate or excessive, so that we have people killed, injured in even when it's just protests in the streets, and we have a lot of children detained regularly. The UN estimates that every year there is about 700 children in the detention. And we have more and more these kind of punitive measures, like home demolitions, because one of the family members is allegedly involved in attacks on settlers or Israeli soldiers. We have punitive residency revocations, which is new. Like as a punishment, you get your Jerusalem residency permit revoked. And more of these kind of like repressive laws. So what Palestinians have been doing, their people have tried all kinds of things to resist this situation, from one that is historical ever since 1967 in East Jerusalem, is that Palestinians boycott Israeli municipal elections, although as so-called permanent residents, they could participate in municipal elections, but there is a boycott in order not to give recognition to this situation. There is also a Palestinians try as much as possible not to cooperate with Israeli institutions and organizations in Jerusalem. And there is, of course, the BDS movement, basically holding accountable and boycotting companies, institutions, not only Israeli, but also foreign ones, who are complicit and participate in the oppression of Palestinians in Jerusalem. And then we have, of course, protests in the streets whenever, or when there are home demolitions, we have protests. A lot of effort into raising international awareness, lobbying, also like advocacy, including in the United Nations. And then what people do every day, it's basically trying to preserve their presence or address in Jerusalem. And people have become experts, even if they no longer succeed to live within the municipal area, to preserve an address for the Israeli authorities, so they won't be able to confiscate or revoke their residency permits in Jerusalem. And then people, of course, always sneak through the checkpoints, still evading all of these restrictions and rules on a daily basis. People also go a lot to Israeli courts, and that's a bit of it has its two sides, because on the one hand, you recognize the Israeli courts if you file petitions there against home demolitions, for example, or land confiscation. But people still do it because they, on the one hand, because they always have some hope that maybe the decision will be in their favor, or at least to gain time. Mostly it's gaining time, because going to courts takes a long time. So you have some extra time to get organized before the house is demolished or the land is confiscated. And in fact, for these last two things people do, going to courts, and the second one is Palestinians developing these alternative urban planning schemes that would allow them to develop their communities. This has been supported a lot by foreign donors, especially the European Union. They want people to go to Israeli courts, and they want people to make these alternative plans. Although we all know that none of these urban planning schemes has ever been accepted by Israel, but it's somehow, there is a lot of international pressure and money to do these kind of things in order to keep some semblance of legality or at least the appearance in Jerusalem. Palestinians are divided over like the last two things. There is a lot of debate about whether one should go to Israeli courts at all or not. And the alternative plans are basically the majority rejected, because you basically make plans for the city that accommodate the existing situation, including the settlements, and then Israel wouldn't even approve them. So this is like the main, I think these are like the main things we have been trying to do. I don't know, that's it for now. We can maybe look at things more in the discussion.
Thank you, Ingrid. I thank both of you, Sheila and Ingrid. Obviously, what you're describing is terrible, just terrible. But I appreciate that both of you are really offering what resistance looks like and are showing what communities do in the face of this kind of violence. And I think we all would agree that land ownership, colonization has always been built on state violence. There's no way to control land and to claim land without some form of violence. And you've touched on the kinds of things that the state has done in both contexts to maintain demographic ideals, right? Their vision for what demographics should look like in each place. So I wonder if you could maybe give us a little bit more of an idea of the kind of tactics that are used by the state to instill fear of the non-ideal residents. What are the ways that the state demonizes undesirables? What is the way that the state instills this ideology of racism? And then how do communities push back against those stereotypes, those racist ideas? I guess I want to explore a little bit about how the state uses fear. So I'm happy to turn it over to either of you first.
In the case of St. Louis, we find that the city hall officials, as well as our media, does a very good job as needed portraying certain areas as undesirable. We found that within the past 10 years, our neighborhood went from being a downtown neighborhood or a downtown adjacent neighborhood to North St. Louis. And when you say North St. Louis, the image is Black, poor, crime, very violent crime, drugs, and a place where you would not want to live. We have a street that runs east and west called Delmar, and it is used as a dividing line between the city of St. Louis. North of Delmar is where I am, and south of Delmar is where all of the entertainment district, and in some cases, development is right at the end of Delmar. So you can see when you're driving that there is a direct difference between north and south of Delmar. We've had board bills set up for fines to be placed on vacant landowners but certain entities are exempt. This past Friday, Board Bill 171 was voted to end those exemptions, but we had no idea that entities like Cortex, which is a huge tech development that was done on Forest Park Parkway, was exempt from their fines if they held vacant property and did not develop it, as long as they were in a development agreement. The exemption was called the McKee exemption because it was obvious that no other single entity was given the opportunity to have their fees waived. So one of our alderpersons, Kara Spencer, was notified by a whistleblower in the buildings division, and it was found that within this board bill that was set years ago by an alderperson who is no longer in office, she heralded it as a way to get vacant land and property owners to maintain their properties in neighborhoods that were finding that vacant property was causing their property to lose value. Yet when it hit the floor of the Board of Aldermen, there was an exemption, and Paul McKee was given an opportunity to be exempted. So Friday, through a lot of discussions with other aldermen, there was a vote, and it was voted into, given an opportunity to go on the Board of Aldermen floor, voted out of committee without objection. In the past, we have seen our alderpersons use this term aldermanic courtesy, that if you are not in the ward that is in question, then really you butt out. But we're seeing a new day here that, you know, your neighborhood and my neighborhood are all city neighborhoods. So what happens in your part of town reflects on the entire city as what happens in our part of the city. So people are starting to understand that, and we really appreciate the fact that even though the 3rd and 5th Ward aldermen were not part of this, they did not sponsor it, they did not co-sponsor it, they did not put any barriers up to allowing this to go through committee.
Well, in the case of Jerusalem, I think Israeli authorities, they are very explicit. It is basically public policy to that Jerusalem, East and West, so is supposed to be a Jewish city. We even have a special public policy that is called like a demographic balance policy, which means that there should be a majority of at least 60 to 70% Jewish population in Jerusalem, East and West, and that has been an official policy since soon after 1967. So that in our case, there is Israel is making no secret of the demographic objectives, and it is all very explicit that Jerusalem has to be predominantly Jewish, and there isn't really a place for Palestinians. Now, what happens a lot, because Jerusalem is a tourist city, so and it has a lot of visitors from abroad. So what is happening is that basically Jerusalem is being developed, including like the old city and like the center of Jerusalem, in a way that foreigners who come to Jerusalem, they will not really see the Palestinian neighborhoods. They disappear, they don't exist, because the way streets and public transportation is built, especially like the way tourists would move, you would never even see the Palestinian neighborhoods except like the old city itself, otherwise they don't exist. And for Palestinians themselves, the intimidation is targeting directly the Palestinian neighborhoods, but they are not visible for others. So you have, of course, this like massive use of force is intimidating. The detention of children and youth and their like treatment. While they're being detained, it's basically to teach them a lesson for the future that if ever you think of protesting, resisting, you will face this kind of punishment. So stay away from it for the future. Fines, taxes, everything is used to intimidate and punish Palestinians. You can have like random traffic fines that are targeting the Palestinian neighborhoods. Or recently we've had even like closures with concrete blocks of Palestinian neighborhoods in response to protests, or of course the raids by police in the night would raid entire neighborhoods and homes and search for like wanted people or so. But all of this intimidation is very targeted to the Palestinian neighborhoods, who for many people who are, or like even Israelis living in Jerusalem, they wouldn't even notice that because the city is so segregated and divided. And for tourists who come, the Palestinian neighborhoods don't really exist.
Right. I'm sure Sheila would agree that here in St. Louis, it's very similar, and that the tourists that are at the Arch just a couple miles from your home would never venture into your neighborhoods, into St. Louis Place or into the north part of the city, right? I want to close out by asking you both about some practical matters. Obviously, we are the Palestine Solidarity Movement. We understand that Jerusalem is central to the issue of Palestine. The forgotten history of the city. I think it's important to go back and remember that Jerusalem was always a multi-ethnic, multicultural, diverse city. A Palestinian vision of the city has always been built on openness and welcoming. I think that part of the colonial project has erased that history. And so we have to think about what are the visions. I know that there is controversy about visions that make room for a colonial reality, but I want to explore what you think are some of the practical ways that our movement and other U.S. social justice movements can support resistance to displacement. What's the best way for us to communicate to audiences here in the U.S. and to uplift these struggles?
I think that first and foremost, people have to understand that they are oppressed. We have a level of comfort in the United States and in our cities that as long as it is not in my backyard, that it is not my problem. And we even have that here in St. Louis Place. There are people who were in favor of the NGA coming to their community, come into the neighborhood, even though their neighbors were going to lose their homes. If you can understand and wear the shoes of others, then you can easily see that we are all in this together. The worst thing that has ever happened to our community is the division that was set forth by outside entities to tell people that they were going to lose something if they continued to listen to what people who were in opposition had to say. And that has been the hardest part to come back from. We challenge people every day to look around them and find out, what has the city done for you? You have a neighbor who will help you at any turn, who is even concerned about you and will check on you and check on your well-being, but the city will not. If you build a community of people who are of like mind and of like spirit, no matter where they come from, we understand that there are more of us than there are them. And the fight has always been an us versus them, and we've always been without help. And people feel like, who would concern themselves with us or this or some matter that, you know, people find minuscule, or they don't even know if their neighbors are even concerned. But knowing that there's outside communities that are suffering, and in the case of Palestine, they suffer more than we could ever know, but they understand that, you know, our challenges are their challenges. We must understand the same.
Thank you, Sheila.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, maybe the what we see often. First of all, I think especially in the United States, maybe people still very little understand the forcible displacement of Palestinians in Jerusalem, but also elsewhere. But maybe since Jerusalem is like the better known place, so yes, especially like in Jerusalem, it is not understood what is happening to Palestinians and how systematic and how long ongoing this has been. So, and I think in both cases, whether it's St. Louis or here, there should be much more awareness that people should never be forced to leave their homes. Like it is basically to force people to leave their home without their consent is something that is simply illegal, unlawful, and it shouldn't happen. And yani involuntary movement, it also means that you have to have a realistic option to stay. You have to be able to say, no, I want to stay. Otherwise, you are forced to leave. So I think there's been a lot of effort to kind of like make it look as people move voluntarily. And I think that is something that should be like more questioned and more exposed, that it's, if you like offer people money to leave and they agree, it doesn't mean necessarily that this is so voluntary, because maybe they don't have many other options. They don't have an option to stay. So maybe there is something like to have more of a conversation about this kind of like forcible displacement of people, because I think it's not enough understood by even like the people affected themselves often. They think they are making their choice, although they are not even able to make a real choice.
Well, I'm so grateful to both of you. I'm gonna give Rama a chance, right, for the U.S. campaign to say what they are trying to do on these issues. Yes.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you so much, both Sheila and Ingrid, for your words. And both of you were alluding to the need to really tell each other stories more, to listen to each other's stories, understand, you know, what is the impact of these things that we're talking about, theoretically seeing what that impact is on the ground and trying to understand that. And I think also from a very practical level, thinking about when we're talking about campaigns to run, specifically around boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS campaigns, a lot of times these systems of oppression, we want to draw the connections around between these systems of oppressions, and those connections include the corporations, the institutions, the companies that are profiting from these systems of oppression, whether it be here in the United States or Palestine. So one example of this is the Stolen Homes campaign, which is a campaign that we, along with several of our partners, have been running that targets Airbnb. For folks who don't know, Airbnb is the website where people can kind of rent out their, you know, a room in their house for people who are looking for a place to stay. And Airbnb in the United States has been both profiting off of gentrification, but also contributing it, because it's much more profitable for people to, rent out homes that they own, apartments that they own for shorter period of times, than to allow people to actually move in and families to actually move in and have a stable household. And so Airbnb has been targeted by a lot of housing rights groups in the United States, tenants' rights groups in the United States, because they refuse to understand that they're contributing to a major problem and, causing an increase in housing prices, which is another way that people are being displaced from their communities because they can no longer afford the rent in their communities. Airbnb also happens to allow settlers living in illegal settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to also rent out their properties. And so they are profiting as well from the colonization and displacement of Palestinians. And so I think it's also important to think, while we're sharing stories, where we're learning about things on a much, learning about how these systems of oppression are impacting communities, that we also look at where the corporations are that are profiting and how we can create circumstances that they are forced to end their profiting and really increase the pressure on ending these systems of oppression.
No, thank you so much, Rama. I think that in this hour that went by very quickly for me, I think we're just scratching the surface and beginning to think about opportunities for mutuality, for solidarity, for lifting up one another. And these stories are certainly the start. So I'm so grateful to both of our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Sheila, for joining us today. And I look forward to having further conversations with both of you and in our wider communities about these parallels. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And this is Anna from the U.S. campaign. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. Thank our facilitator, Sandra Tamari, who's co-chair of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights Steering Committee, as well as Ingrid and Sheila. This was a really powerful testament to the way that displacement and colonization impacts communities across the globe. I wanted to let people know that this webinar will be posted on the Together We Rise section of the U.S. Campaign's website in a section called Freedom Bound, Resisting Zionism and White Supremacy, that really explores the way that U.S. and Israeli colonialism and racism are connected, and listening to the voices of Black, Latinx, Palestinian, Indigenous communities, and others talking about resistance in this political moment. And there's a lot about Indigenous struggle, Black Palestinian solidarity, the refugee bans we see from in the US and Palestine, the walls being built in Palestine as well as on the US-Mexico border, Islamophobia and how it is used, and actually the way that Zionism has an impact on communities around the world, not only Palestinians. And Together We Rise will also be the theme of our 2018 conference, which is happening September 28th to 30th in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. Together We Rise, Resilience Across Movements. And that'll be a place where we can really look at the situation in Palestine, in the United States, build our skills in organizing and resisting, including through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, a powerful way to support Palestinian resistance by ending our complicity with the Israeli apartheid regime. Learning about cultural resistance and lots of things. So we invite people to join us there. And please check out the Together We Rise section of uscpr.org, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights website. Thanks so much for joining us.